Good morning. This is Travis Marker, and we have America Francis, and we're with Stewart Growth, and we're going to have this is our October Readers Book Club, and this is a recorded podcast. Anybody's welcome to join. These are not presentations, but kind of collaborative podcasts, and so anybody who desires can jump in. Also, today we're going to be focusing on why Halloween literature. We're not necessarily going to explore a specific book, which is what makes this group different than other book clubs, is we're talking more about genres. And it's October, so why not Halloween literature? So let's play. Um, I guess, do you have any opening thoughts, America, on like why do you think people read Halloween literature or scary literature, spooky literature?
That's a good question. I think some of the reason why they do it is just to process some of their emotional stuff, things that are frightening, things that are weird.
So it's a way to I guess just explore fears. I
Well,
wonder.
and also include things that people generally would reject. So if you're talking about people from other cultures or whatever becoming more familiar and accepting, like um, finding some kind of affection for the witch because of her backstory, or you know starting to get sympathetic about the characters even though maybe they're not as attractive or um, as expect their behavior is a little different.
So I guess there's two, like, for the witches, a lot of literature with witches has corrected injustice. Like, I mean, a lot of the Salem witch trial stuff is corrected injustice by exploring, like, you allowed your bias to destroy lives, you allowed your prejudice, your racism, your avarice, your whatever to like wipe out people. And then there's the idea that some of those stories are being told from the righteous perspective, that like things that were evil were wiped out. And so it's interesting that some spooky literature is a sense of how do we vindicate the things that um were unrighteously purchased, or like unfairly or unduly or um blindly persecuted, versus I took on the battle and I beat this thing that needed to be destroyed from the devil. And so it seems like some from the religious context there's that sense of I'm talking about how I defeat the devil. From social justice perspective, it's like, well, here's how your fear created injustice in something that you didn't understand, or that you, and they may not even be the same people, right? Like one story might be an actual vindication of conquering the devil, and another story might be a totally separate story that outlines, just prejudice and social injustice, like the Salem witch trials. With, it's a great play with by Arthur Miller, The Crucible, which is made into the movie, and a Winona Ryder plays in it. It turns out that I had four witches that were actually in that process in my family history that were killed. So three were on my
What?
mom's, yeah, three on my mom's side and one on my dad's side. And Arthur Miller does a great job referencing it as a an analogous story to, communism in the McCarthy period, the Red Scare, and how do we,
Labeling people.
yeah, and chasing our fears, and trying to help people feel comfortable with their fears inside of, religious or scary context. Like, well, what does this thing mean, this ism? What is communism? Like, what does it actually mean by way of destroying our country? um but then also Arthur Miller talks about the Salem witch trials in the context of these were people who had left the contract. So when they got to Massachusetts, they entered into this holy contract that they were going to live and be covenant people of God. And but what they did is they they started to sue each other in like huge numbers. Like they actually had a lot, like they had large amounts of legal disputes with each other in which they would sue each other for defamation or line boundaries, or and they weren't winning And so when these witch trials came up, it created an option to like fix the problem, because some of the people being killed were going to lose their property, or they were going to lose their inheritance, or they were going to lose, because if you died a witch, then you forfeited your property. So there's one example
They
where
killed people for their land. Ew.
yeah, and there was one individual who did not want to die repentant, and so they were crushing him, and they asked him if he had any last words, and his last words were more weight. Like he wanted to die faster because at least he would preserve the property for his family. So it's an interesting idea of how that's just one segment of our history, that where we they take something in momentum, right? Like they take this good thing, the idea of being a people of God, and yet as they become kind of like distant from that commitment to God, but yet they also don't want to be the people who left that commitment to God. They start to use the commitment to God to create other forms of justice, whether it's in the court or whether it's at the, as witches. And I mean,
They
how
become God. They say, I don't need God. I can decide who's the bad guy and who's the good
right.
guy.
Yeah, and it's written in literature, right? I mean, there's lots of historical ways that you prove if somebody's a witch, and we're grateful for Monty Python and the Holy Grail on how you know if somebody's a witch. They weigh more than a duck.
Well, the other thing I think is exploring the dark sides of yourself. Some of those stories are, can you accept the parts of you that you're not so comfortable with?
Yeah. Well, and you think about that also comes up in the witch trials, because like Martha Nurse, who was she was the midwife, and she was one on my side. That was one of my grandmas who died. She was able to have kids, and some of the ladies who weren't able to have kids. So they felt like that indicated that she was a witch because of her uniquenesses, right? And so there's that jealousy about how do we. And even if you think about the Inquisition in Europe, like where millions of midwives and just healers were killed because of their natural propensity just to understand the human body, the female body, herbs. Like it was just a skill that somebody else didn't possess that creates that I shouldn't be deficient, so I have to kill the thing that makes me feel deficient.
Ah, wow.
But on the other side, if you look
Amazing
at,
we've lasted this long.
I agree, but another side is the Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, where coming to your idea of um, exploring what's in yourself, being able to parse it out and saying like, this is my good side and this is my bad side. But there was actually an
Shoulder
addictiveness.
angels too. Like,
Yeah, but
which one are you feeding?
right. And there's actually this addiction on his side to the bad guy because he felt so unfiltered. He felt so kind of raw that there was this addictive power in just embracing that rawness rather than being kind of controlled and being the social conformity, right?
That
Like,
actually happens a lot in real life where people have a double life and there's a religious leader or somebody and everyone's shocked that they have this other completely different world.
yeah, well, like Jeffrey Dahmer, like he looked, I mean, some people said like a Mormon missionary, and like you would have no idea that he's doing just totally sadistic stuff.
Mormon missionaries are very attractive.
Well, I think what I find interesting about, um, I think it's interesting that there's literature that does scare us and creates a vicarious experience. But then I think there's this other side where we read true crime and we like watch Netflix series about true crime that is in fact sadistic and like it's not vicarious, right? This is actually really morbid stuff.
Well, and people can develop like they can see these things and copycat them. People can read things and watch things and then do bad things.
Yeah. And how do we deal with that in society? Like, why does our society become fixated on, like, in fact, true morbid, sadistic crime versus kind of leaving it in the Victorian era or, just kind of the horror suspense? What is fixation? Like, even the American Psychopath, where the guy is literally just a psychopath, just killing lots of bodies, people.
I have not seen American Psychopath. I think
Well,
I'd be disturbed.
I have not seen it either, but I'm just saying, like, the book, like, people read the
Oh
book,
my
like,
gosh, I can't even read books like that. So, what I'm thinking is some of it is the desensitization where people want to feel something and it takes an increasingly disturbing thing to make them feel anything.
okay, so yeah, so there's some people experience extreme morbidity or whatever for the perspective of just making sure they feel alive.
Yeah, and I think there's some kind of some people get excited about it.
I mean, there are definitely people with mental illness, right? I mean, that they have propensities towards things that are definitely morbid.
Or maybe they were abused, or maybe things have happened. Maybe there's a genetic something, I don't know.
Hmm. Yeah, I think I don't personally enjoy the true crime stuff because it is so haunting. I think some of that relates to I just don't think I've ever really had that desire to like explore morbidity. Like
You ever see any of that at work?
I do see it at work, however. That's my problem is that um like working in the juvenile court for many years, over 15 years of active cases in the juvenile court, like they all involve abuse, dependency, or neglect regarding a child, but oftentimes of also adults. And in representing a person who has engaged in that type of conduct, you nearly 100% of the time they have some kind of mental illness, right? Like that that doesn't necessarily mean that they have a personality disorder, but maybe it's like they're overcompensating for stress responses, anxiety, depression, their own neglect, abandonment triggers. But every one of those cases comes from a perspective of some form of unfortunate horror, right? I mean, like when
And
if
I
you're
think it's hard for empathetic people to experience that.
yeah, I mean, like if
It's traumatic to see that type of evidence or hear the recounting of it.
yeah, and I think that I guess that's why for a lot of reasons that stuff's not fun. I think that when you read again, I think it's called The Glass Castle. Is that the book that was made in the movie about the girl who becomes a professor, but she kind of has super her parents sound like tremendously intelligent, but yet they're just super nonconformists and they like to eat out of dumpsters and stuff, right? Like there's a part
Uh,
of that that's not really necessarily a horror story, but I mean they have alcohol issues in that, and they have lots of family dynamic issues. So I guess there's a difference between somebody telling a story of like I got through my process and it was super bizarre and it was also full of really neglectful bad behavior, but the story is not fantasized, like there's not a romanticization of what was experienced as okay, you know like
yeah.
like when you read I Know Why the Cage Bird Sings by Maya Angelou. She's talking about when she gets raped by her mom's boyfriend.
Oh boy.
It's a horrible scene, and it's very sad, but she's immediately processing it from a perspective that you understand what it means to her, that being tremendously neglected and craving love, even in this destructive thing, her confusion was, why would love feel so bad? Like, why would it hurt? Like, why would, but she was trying to embrace this guy who's raping her because she just needed that affection so badly, but she also grows up and able to distance herself from that, right? She's able to parse it out. But the fact that she can identify that emotional engagement is super powerful because it's what helps us understand a lot of human stories have that kind of problem, right? Where we get into situations because
Well,
of love we think we deserve, or because of the situation we think we want, and then we get there, we're like, oh my gosh, I wanted something so bad that I couldn't see, you know, or the adult that was supposed to do their job didn't do it, or this person is supposed to do their job didn't do it, or
There's a lot of messed up about life.
yeah,
I think part of the reason people like the Halloweeny stuff is that they can be afraid and then realize that they're okay. And so maybe part of that process of resolving it, where they're like, I thought that thing was really scary, but everything's really actually fine.
yeah, I agree that I think when we come away from true crime and and kind of like these juvenile court stories to fanciful like vampires, werewolves.
Well, I'm thinking haunted houses.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah, well, yeah, I'm going that direction. Like, I mean, vampires, they live in haunted houses, right? Or like ghosts, and there's something fanciful about it, right? It's not like they're not vampires.
I'm talking about like real life experiences where people go out to be afraid.
Oh, okay. So you're like when they
Not
go
about the
to a
book,
haunted.
more
Okay,
just about the Halloween vibe.
yeah, they can be scared and then they come away from. It. They got to.
Yeah, true crime. That's hard stuff.
Yeah, well, but I think people read Halloween literature for the same reason they would go to a haunted house. Like you read Dracula because you want to be scared, not because there's a Dracula. I mean, um you read about, you know, Anne Rice's vampire series because there's these elements about it that are interesting, you know, seductive, and you want to think that a rational person would not be seduced by a demon who can live forever sucking your blood. But
So it gives you a little bit of hope because you can predict the story in the book, even though in real life things are less clear and harder to navigate.
yeah, because like the, you know, because I think the difference is Dracula is also 50 Shades of Grey, where you submit yourself to something that you think you can overcome, and people read 50 Shades of Grey because they can also put it away, right? They were not subject to 50 Shades of Grey, but um they can walk away from it, just like
Yeah.
you can walk away from Dracula and you can walk away from, you know, some of these other stories.
Mm-hmm.
But what I thought was interesting was that as 50 Shades of Grey became super popular, people like said this in real life is not fun. Like this is, but there are people who they have some pretty interesting experiences
Okay, so the
that they willingly
conversation
choose.
allowed people to discuss it, and then people heard the perspective of you can fantasize it about it, but the reality is not good.
Right. But I think also, you know, is because I wrote a short story on kind of monsters and the idea of monsters being relevant in relationships because
We
at
gonna
different
post it? Do we get a link?
I did not post it. I haven't published it, but I did write it and I did review it with my book, my writing group. They liked it. So, but
Cool.
the idea of monsters in relationships does come like if you think about a werewolf, right? This is a cyclical person who can be very normal and then a person who's a monster. And we have that in relationships. I mean, they some of those people are manic depressive, or they could be seasonal disorders, or if it's a woman, they could, you know, be on their periods, or they could, and we're not talking about any kind of disparagement, like just people have cycles that they go through.
All women have cycles.
Well, but the idea that they're pissed off and so they must be on that period is, I mean, that's an overgeneralization.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
but even there's research that say men have kind of like cycles. That it's not necessarily menstruation, but it's the idea of a similar concept that they're going through. They go through periods of months or weeks or whatever in which maybe they're on top of their game, and then they have the kind of the period where they're not on top of the game. Like I have a client who at the end of the month he knows he has to get all the money to pay his bills, and so also he becomes a very different person.
Mm,
Where the first couple of weeks he's paid all the bills, so it's not a big deal. But then he gets to the end of the month and he hasn't, so then he's like super intense.
mm.
So that's our werewolf. If we think about um the vampire is often that person we're dating who is very seductive, but yet when when it comes to like intimacy, it's all of a sudden becomes aggressive or really weird. Or so like at one point it was super passionate and it was super fun and you're being seduced and you're really excited, and then all of a sudden you get to where it's intimate and it's like strange and people are like, what just happened?
You pick up the stick and you get both sides of the stick.
Yeah.
And why are people so attracted to the bad boys? Like, why are they loving that dark side?
Right. Well, that's the vampire, right? I mean, very seductive, whatever, but do we really appreciate what it means when it comes to the final commitment, right?
Yeah, there's a lot of discussion sometimes about why, guys try to be nice and they're like, nobody wants nice.
Yeah. But I think this is not necessarily a Halloween book, but there's a book called The Nice Guy Syndrome by
Mm.
Grover. Very exceptional book. I think it applies to men and women, but it talks about the anxious personality. There is something about the bad guy, I mean, or the bad boys, in that they are at least driven towards a goal consistently, and they are not infringed upon by anxiety and stress, and therefore they can kind of like they perform all the way through, but it's kind of like with indifference, right?
It's confidence and persistence. Is it that?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely, yeah, there's a confidence, persistence. They know their goals, they know where they're going, they know what they want, and so women are attracted to security, right? They're attracted to people who can perform, that can like get things done,
Mhm.
and but then at the end they're upset because it comes at this price of they're not being heard, they're not being
They're
attended to.
inflexible. Yeah.
Where the nice guy, is often very anxious, um,
Passive.
passive, not very self-confident.
Yeah.
um, their performance kind of they choke often because they just don't know exactly where they're supposed to be or what's supposed to happen.
They're not ambitious. They just kind of
Yeah,
clock
they're like,
in.
yeah, they're comforting, but they're not necessarily secure, right? They perform on very low levels so that people like them, but they don't really perform in ways that show that they care about themselves and take care of themselves. And so, yeah, we want the Dracula because, I mean, like there's a lot of assertive seduction.
Powerful. Yeah. Well, and I think sometimes it's just a cultural perception of what's okay for men's behavior. Like there's been a lot of conversation about that. Like, do you want men to be able to express their emotions and things like that? And then they get kind of um, punished for showing softer sides.
Yeah. Well, and they do get punished because, like, we have this thing. I mean, that's shame for men, right? Shame for men is you didn't comply with their expectations of the ideal man, even though the ideal man may be like super hard to manifest. Because even the Dracula character, even though there's an assertive dominance to that performance, they're
Like
not fully
machismo.
reading the ideal because they don't have emotional content. But too much emotional content plus anxiety doesn't provide either.
You just cannot win.
Yeah, but I think if you come to the point that you can be confident in yourself and your emotions, and you can be fine. But the point is that um, the nice guys don't generally win because of that lack, where the bad boys win to the detriment of the woman because they're that dominant position with that creates suffering. But at least you have a house and you have a job. And you have...
Woo.
So what about the Frankenstein? What do you think the role of Frankenstein is?
Um, well, we could be back to trying to be God again. Like this guy is putting pieces together and giving it life, and it's not his place to do that.
Yeah, it's warning literature, right? It's the literature about it's the horror of becoming God and not being able to pay the price to be God, right? Because the guy creates the monster, and the monster, in fact, is like, I'm created, so love me. He's like, you're hideous, like you are ugly. He's like, then make me a woman, like make me something that I can like cherish and I can connect with. It's and he's like, you're a monster. Like we're not playing this game. Like so it's this sense of how do our ambitions that we can't control, how do they come back on us? How do our ambitions?
Unintended consequences. Well, I took a family in the law class at BYU, and there was some discussion about surrogates and some of those things. And it's amazing the type of complexity you can get into where people are like, I don't even know who my parents are, and I want to know where I came from and what my identity is, and connected. I want to be connected with whoever I came from, but I just, was created in a lab by donated stuff. And it really just gets complicated.
Yeah. Well, have you, this is a good book that I just read, was called The Latecomer, and I cannot remember who it was by, but it's this mother who wants her identity to be kind of secured, and she just really feels her purpose is to be a mother, and yet she cannot have babies. So she goes through all kinds of sorry processes to get pregnant, and finally there's four eggs in a petri dish, three work, and they just leave one frozen, and until like 10 or 15 years later, and they bring out the last one, and then that's the latecomer, but it's actually the same age as the other ones, right? and and there is in that book this sense of reconciling, I'm a petri dish baby, like how I, and all four kids have to kind of identify like what who am I if I'm from a petri dish, even though I
But they
can't.
had siblings, right? They had siblings at least.
Yeah, but it's still, but there's an identity because of the artificial nature of the process, and
Even
the
if you're
final.
wanted by the person who put you in like somebody ordered that.
Yeah, but I thought in the late cover she does a good job kind of with the tension and identity crisis that comes from that. As and and even my uncle who teaches physiology at Green Bay University talks about the psychological issues of science and biology, and like preserving life treatment that preserves babies, but also preserving life treatment that preserves people who should die. Like there's horror stories that come out of maybe some people just should have died, but it becomes hard because we now have the technology and the capacity to make that not happen. Like they don't have to. So how do we deal with some of those dilemmas of, the person is alive, but should they be alive?
And going through all of those thought processes in literature can be really helpful before people try and navigate that in real life.
Yeah. Well, and also the um this comes up also in the juvenile court in England in the book by Ian McEwan called The Children Act, which I think is also now a movie or a series on Netflix or something. I haven't seen that, but I read the book, and the question of a Jehovah's Witness child getting an infusion that in fact
Yeah.
saves the child's life, but now creates a spiritual dilemma because did the court force the child to endure something that now puts him out of step with God, or it is, but it was also out of step with his religious culture and his religious community. And
Sometimes it's really hard to be a judge, as you would probably relate to.
it is, yeah, it's good. So let's talk about the mummy. What does the mummy represent?
I mean, the first thought that comes to me is just you think things are put away and then they come back and get you. So maybe it's just you got to be careful about those skeletons in your closet. Maybe just stay on the nice list instead of the naughty list. I know I'm mixing lots of things here, but just
No, I think
come
I agree.
out.
Yeah,
Things
I
come
agree with you.
back.
No, I agree with you. I think the idea of the mummy is the sense that something was supposed to be closed and resolved, but you're disturbing it. Like, you go to the crypt, you disturb the crypt, you rob the crypt of its treasures, and the mummy has been cursed because it was not supposed to be disturbed, right? That question of how do we let things, should things be disturbed, but if they are disturbed,
Let
how do we,
things lie.
yeah, let things lie. But even I was thinking about Lazarus and the tomb, right? That he comes out of the tomb in his clothes, like he comes out in wrapped up bandages. So he's a literal mummy. And I was thinking of that the other day as I went through that experience in the New Testament. I was thinking, man, this is a mummy, kind of. I mean, he's not mummified, but he's not coming out, walking in his day
He
clothes. Like
was dead.
he must have. And what did he represent? Like it's a tremendously supernatural thing. And what was his life like after? Because we have Pet Cemetery, which is definitely like it's the mummy gone crazy because it's like once you've buried them, they should be buried. Like they should like that closed that thing. Like that was the natural process because it happened. So leave it because you cannot like once you bring back the dog, it becomes Cujo, right? It's not the nice sensitive cat. Like you bring back what so
Well, and maybe it's also something about disturbing the dead looking for treasure. Like maybe it's not all about the mummy. Maybe it's sort of why are you out there digging up stuff, trying to like, is
are,
the gold
are you
really the
looking for
best
some yeah,
treasure?
yeah, right. Are you looking for something in the past that just isn't there? Like
Is that your
is your
treasure
work
or does that belong to the pharaoh that, it was respectfully given to the earth? Is it your job to go pull that out and what do you do with it?
yeah. And then there's also, because there could be a curse, but then there's also the reality that it ends up in a museum. So sometimes there's that other process of maybe we're creating horror stories or fears around disturbing the past, and it actually isn't a problem. We learn from it. We appreciate it. We embrace the past, and it's okay because there aren't curses, there aren't horror stories. There might be things that are uncomfortable, but maybe that uncomfortableness is a good thing for society to experience, which is coming into our schools right now with the cancel culture. How do we cancel sections of history like that doesn't even make sense. The idea that you would cancel a population's history, like even if you're conservative or liberal, it doesn't even make any sense to say we should just not look at history as it is because like it happened. Like we should say like that was a
Or look
horror
at it
story.
from today's lens. You
Yeah,
guys did that because we wouldn't do that now.
which is definitely appropriate. But if we don't know what it was, like we can't learn from it either.
And I'm also wondering if it's some kind of a twist with a mummy on like a resurrection thing where um people are trying to come back, but really they should just stay dead. Like maybe it's not their turn to come back and be beautiful and glorified. Maybe trying to go around the natural order. You're a rotted corpse still. You didn't come about this in a way that's God's way of coming back perfect, and you came back because of some other evil way.
Yeah, well, maybe the sense of there's a timing to the resurrection. There's a timing to coming back. There's a process. Like you can't skip process and come back the way you're supposed to unless you go through the process.
You don't come through the cursed medallion.
There you go. All right, I like that. All right, what's another which one haven't we talked about? Which monsters haven't we talked about?
What are the monsters?
I guess one of the books that I cycle. I usually in October I will read a Ray Bradbury book, and I'll pick either Fahrenheit 451 regarding book burning, or I will pick Something Wicked This Way Comes. I really like those two books. One is that sense of the horror that comes from ignorance, and the suppression of ignorance, the suppression of freedom to think, because we're burning books and people are dying in out. They're choosing to be burned in their house with their books. But then also something wicked this way comes, is that reference to the things that are our fears that we can't confront. Therefore, they become the weaknesses that will destroy us because the carnival is able to trade. So that the carnival trades with the old lady for beauty, but she loses her sight, so she can't appreciate her beauty. Another person gains, he he can become older, but he has to lose. I mean, you always have to trade. So if you can reconcile where you're at, there's nothing that the carnival can take from you. But if you can't reconcile where you're at, then you have something to trade, but you won't be able to appreciate the trade.
Ah,
So those are I like something wicked this way comes, and I think there is a lot of that literature that relates to I'm afraid of the thing I can't be anymore, or the thing I was, or the thing that I can't ever become. And so I'm going to suffer inside the loss rather than embracing like this is where I'm at.
I'm curious how many times you've read some of these books.
I don't know how many times I've read those two books. Like it's been a while.
10 times?
I,
18 times?
I don't know if I read them 18 times, but I might be close to 10 times.
I'm not saying they're not good books. It's just it's curious to me that you read so many books and still repeat some of your favorites that many times. I mean, I can understand 2 or 3 times. When you get to 10 times, that's really, I mean, you could practically probably recite some of those passages.
Well, I think what's interesting is what they mean to your my personal maybe rituals of
It's
learning.
like the seasonal thing. It's not
Yeah,
Halloween unless you read your spooky book.
yeah. Like a Christmas Carol, I probably have read more than 10 times, but it's like a touchstone, right? It's like a thing you should go back to and just touch it because of the importance of the thing that you're getting from it each time. Like the lesson should be repeated. Like it's part of the ritual of learning. Like there's just some things that you should be impacted by over and over again because of the depth of the awareness as you get each time.
Sounds like we need to put together some kind of blog post and put together your list of books that you read, or at least the categories. Like, what are other times of year that you pay attention to in those ways? Is it Christmas and Halloween, and what else?
Well, like I read When Pride Still Matters. This is by David Marinus. It's about the life of Vince Lombardi. I usually read it also around September, October, because it's a football book, but it also is the life of Vince Lombardi and how a person got through stuff. Like he didn't just make it, right? Like reading about Vince Lombardi is this sense of just the process of appreciating process, that you don't just get out. Like you don't just get to excel. You have to create a process that you go through, and it might take years, but because he persistently saw the goal in his head, he did it, but he had to keep that goal persistently in front of him. So like I read that, and then there's also some really heartwarming books by Richard Peck that are about Grandma Dowdle, and one of those is A Long Way from Chicago. Another is A Year Down Yonder, and then there's A Season of Gifts. And they are they do process, but they're generational. So like it's the same lady, so she's getting older, but you don't know that she's getting older because she's still the same hardy woman. But she's a grandma in all three, and she's a grandma in different ways, but she kind of like is an equilibrium setter for the town because she just does what needs to be done despite social norms and cultural norms. And but she's always like, I mean, she's like a
There is
Batman.
a theme
Yeah, she's
with
like the
you.
bat. Yeah, she's like the Batman for the community, but she's just a woman, right? I mean, it's like she's not
What?
supernatural. Well, I mean, she's a human being. She's not a millionaire.
Yeah,
She's not
yeah, yeah.
like, yeah. So she's just this really powerful grandma who just understands how to reset things, right?
And what's more powerful and empowering than letting a person know they don't have to have superpowers and they can still be very, very influential like that? Like, it's even better for a grandma to think, I can do that too.
Yeah. Well, and they're the type of books that like at one point you are laughing out loud because I read them to my kids when they were little. Now we just listen to them in the car and stuff because they're old enough that they just we do them. And then another point, like you're like tear jerking up and you're crying because you're just like this lady is so sweet.
Sweet vigilante.
Yeah, she's awesome. Um, I think most of my repeat books are in the fall and Christmas because I guess they just that's like the
You're
sentimental.
reflecting on the year.
Yeah. And you just want to kind of take a break from some of the stress, the tension, the striving.
Well, and maybe also you're starting to come in from outside and, kind of get warm and eat soup and sit by the fire. And
Yeah.
it's dark at night. So you come home and read a book instead of going out and doing whatever other thing.
Well, and another thing our kids have done for a long time, because when my wife went to school, when we had four kids, she went back to school. We were in school together, and then I got my law degree, and then she went back to school, and I had four kids, and she said, "Okay, you're going to take the kids all day Saturday," and I just like all day. I mean, like you don't want me to check back in, I'm like, and one of them was a baby who was intermittently breastfeeding probably at that point still and like diaper changing and I was like so you trust me like but it was the best thing that ever happened because I just started having day dates with my kids like all day Saturdays and we would leave after we would clean the house and then we would leave um and I usually went to the library. We usually did some kind of field trip thing. We usually visited with grandparents and stuff, but we always listened to audiobooks in the car as we did this because Susan Wise Bauer, who's a homeschool advocate, talks a lot about how children in audiobooks creates the sense of love of learning and they love a story. And so kids like to read and that's been the truth. My wife's been pretty outstanding that way. She of our six kids, the three that have graduated have all gotten presidential scholarships to the local college. And like so all it's definitely paying off. But the traditional process of getting into stories with my kids has been outstanding. Like we really love it. But Harry Potter's birthday is around July, 31st or 22nd, something like that. So usually in July
What
we
is
will
his
start
birthday?
when in July we will start the Harry Potter series. And we usually do book one and then we kind of decide now if we want to listen to it straight through or if we want to do, skip some. But uh 6 and 7 seem to be pretty popular. So right now we're in book 6 and uh we're but this is something we do every year. Like so basically in July and then we kind of like play through until we get to into the holidays and then we'll stop and then pick it
Then
up
do you
again.
watch the shows? You don't watch the movies.
Yeah, we don't do the movies, but we but we read a lot of books like that are kind of repeats. And if you think about Harry Potter, like I remember when it first came out, there was like pastors, some of them, would be on and some would be off saying you shouldn't study
Oh,
witchcraft. But others are like, look, it's a human story. Like it's just a human story.
imaginative.
Yeah. And the power of like Harry Potter it helps you go somewhere that you don't really exist, but it's a completely normal story. Like it is not, in fact, an abnormal story. Like there are like your dad's friends are still relevant to your dad's children. Like it's amazing how many of my dad's friends I know, and even though they are not blood related, like they're nearly blood related. Like I know they have the same criteria as my uncles and aunts, right? And they still have stories that they're trying to process. They still have history that they're trying to process. They still have dilemmas that they're still trying to process. I remember going down the street and my dad's like, he just like this guy that my dad did not really like in high school moved across the street from my dad. And I understood somehow I was supposed to hate his kids. Like I did not know how I knew that, but like I was supposed to not like his kids. Like that's Draco Malfoy and Harry Potter.
Ah!
And the nice thing is we got over that. Like we actually grew up and we became good friends, and it was not a big deal. My parents became good friends with them, but it was surprising how they had to get over high school. Like they had to get over some of that stuff, which that's Harry Potter, right? And
Yeah,
then
it's interesting in rural places. It can take like sometimes people just keep those grudges
yeah, well, and they're
because they stay in one place for a long time. I guess people that are moving so much just move on and they don't need to engage still, but people who have an ongoing conflict and that person's there and going to be there for a long time, it can be a little opposition.
yeah, but that's exactly what Harry Potter says, right? We're just dealing with witches. Like it's just a different context, and that's also what Isaac Asimov and many of the science fiction writers said about space is that you just take normal life and you put it in space, and then people like want to read it. But if it's like down in normal life, then they're like, I don't know.
Uh,
So rather than play with some kind of science fiction quantum mechanics, you're just playing with spells and stuff like that. But the rules still apply. Like I thought it was interesting how many rules J.K. Rowling adds into the process that you like. There are rules that must be complied with because they're kind of like eternal in nature, which that's also part of life, right? That like whether people believe in karma or not, like you can't really dispute a person who doesn't comply with being a nice person like reaps the reward of that. Like you can't deny that. And I think that she does a great job identifying. I like the idea of hidden magic. The idea of, and this comes up with C.S. Lewis in The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, is the more ancient magic is that a person would give their life for their friend or give their life for somebody, and that creates a different magic or a different bond or a different rule because of the sacrifice connected to that, which is interesting that Voldemort, like he's like Morgoth in the Lord of the Rings. He's putting his soul into an object. And by putting his soul into an object, it appears to help him live forever and give him endless power, but it also depletes himself so that he is less of a person. In fact, not just, that, but the idea that if we keep only worrying about how we give ourselves or preserve ourselves, there's a hole there, there's a vacuum that destroys us. So I think that's interesting that there's lots of motifs that just continue to cycle. Where if we give, we survive. Good.
let's talk for a second about objects, about like wands and like talismans and whatever, like all the stuff that gives you magic powers.
I think it's interesting because I don't know why it matters, but it does. Because like you think about a raccoon. Why does a raccoon collect little objects? Why does a crow collect little shiny objects? And
Mm.
even myself, like I have no idea what it means to me, but like I go to little places and like I got this from the national park, my little deck of cards, and I don't buy big expensive things. Like I don't care to buy big expensive things, but like I got that deck of cards at Yellowstone. I got this postcard from Glacier National Park. And I just keep these little tokens because they're empowering because they provide a memory, and the memory is empowering because it helps me remember what I have achieved or what I've done or the like,
Who you are.
yeah, who I am. The signs and tokens, stuff like that are about creating the ritual of remembering and empowering through an object. Like the thing is it's a token of the thing that is going to help you um bring to remembrance something.
Huh.
And the problem, like you deal with the swastika, it shows up in Rudyard Kipling's books because it's prior to Hitler's Germany and represents eternity and concepts of eternity. and then it becomes totally morphed by Hitler, which he's trying to create an eternal thing also. But now it's like, oh geez, like there's a consequence to that. Um, and so
Some
yeah, I
of
think
the real life stuff is so disturbing. Like it's way more than some of those stories. You look at the dictators that killed millions and millions of people. Like it is interesting when you look at, attractive people that are monsters that we were talking about before. Sometimes it's really hard to see what like the monster is inside. The monster is behavior and thinking and not the physical appearance. And some monsters that, I mean, people that are have features that people don't like can be really dear, wonderful, good people.
yeah. And so the question is, how do you prevent yourself becoming maybe OCD about objects? Because some things are just objects versus how do we keep them in the perspective of their a reminder, or how do you, I mean, what do you do that creates the rituals of remembrance? I know that
Including gifts too. Like someone gives you something and maybe that makes it special versus maybe it's time to let some things go and clear out so that you can do new things and think new thoughts.
yeah.
I recently went to a house that my great grandfather lived in and his family, and they had some really old things there. And I was wondering how long those things had been there, and if they moved out, how the house would change by the updates of whoever else moved in that wasn't kind of stuck with all of those previous items.
Mm-hmm. Well, and isn't interesting? Some of those previous items they mean nothing to the next generation. Because like my parents, they have a lot of stuff I just don't connect with. I don't understand what it means. So you have to almost go through the process of being educated about the relevance of the thing so that you can treat it sacred or remember it or whatever, because it's just a thing until it has some value.
So my husband's parents had a lot of things that they thought were special. My husband's grandparents were only children, and it seemed like the things were all passed down to one spot, and they just wanted to give us kind of all of those things and preserve the family legacy. And I said, what I really want are pictures in a notebook with the stories that are attached to all of those pictures, because the objects don't mean anything to me. I'm like new to the family, but if you want the children to understand why we have all of these objects, like maybe you really don't even need the object. Maybe what you need is the story. And it's so easy to just grab it with a 3-ring binder than trying to haul these giant marble tables or whatever they are. Like there were some big things, like rooms full of furniture, and they were like, these things are special and all these things are special, and we want you to have the grand piano. And I'm like, I would have to have a room in my house just dedicated to this piano and haul it from California to Utah, and just like it was a lot of effort to try. And they were moving, so they
Yeah.
moved from Northern California to Southern California, and they said, like, come get all this stuff. And I said, you're going to have to decide. I'm not going to decide for you what to do with all these objects. You need to decide what's important, and you need to decide where the things go, and you need to decide that, like, this stuff belongs to you. I'm not going to take the responsibility by you just giving it to me, and then I have to figure out what to do with it.
This is really good. This is a good transition to two other books to kind of close on. One is Neil Gaiman's The Graveyard Book, because a graveyard of ghosts takes care of a child, because these jacks, these guys called jacks, were going to try to kill the child because of a prophecy related to the child killing all the jacks. But the sense is that instead of the child taking care of the ghost memories, which is what we comes up with what was that Pixar show with the Day of the Dead?
Oh,
Um,
yeah, yeah.
Coco.
Coco.
Coco, yeah. The idea of sometimes that there's that fear of our histories not taking care of ourselves and our future generations, right? That the graveyard is taken care of by the living, so that the dead don't die in our memories. That's the Coco story. But in the graveyard, it's the sense of how how we can actually be rejuvenated and taken care of by our past, by our ghosts, by our histories. Like they can actually instill in us the purpose to live and to stay alive because we're connected to our memories, we're connected to our past, we're connected to our identities and that love and connection that comes from our past, right? The,
That sounds like family history. You got to plug the family history. I know you're totally into it.
yeah, I'm totally into it. But I think that that's also part of the that graveyard process is what do our memories like, because you're talking about, well, what does this thing mean? Well, that's part of that connection. Like I, in order for this to be breached, you can't just give me the thing. You have to instill in me some kind of understanding of the power of that thing.
Who made this? What did they use this thing for? Where did they get it?
Yeah,
Like,
what do you want me to pass on to the kids about this thing? Like, what's its relevance?
yeah.
Which comes to like the hoodoo voodoo stuff in like New Orleans and other places often has a lot of that root magic comes from the power of belief in the thing
Oh,
and how it brings back and connects and empowers.
like Dumbo. You hold this thing and it makes you powerful.
Yes, the feather. So good. I think this has been a really fun conversation. I, and I think this has been great. America, it's always fun to explore these topics with you. I think you're like a great counter player here. It'd be fun if more people joined us, but I think that we have a lot of fun with the topics. I hope that those on the join on YouTube also have fun and connect and join with us in person. It's fun to have a larger audience. If you also want to submit topics and genres for us to explore, it'd be great to have your participation.